Residential sales comparison and income approaches, page 178. Gross income multipliers. Now that the fundamental concepts of the income approach using the GRM technique have been presented, the development and function of a gross income multiplier, or GIM, will be much easier to understand. Fundamental concepts of the GIM and the GRM are very similar in many respects, but some things are different. The use of a gross income multiplier, GIM, is appropriate when the subject property produces income in addition to rent from the living units. With a gross income multiplier, both the rent and the other income are used for the analysis, while the GRM considers only rent. There are some special things to know about using the GIM in a market value assignment. Each of these points will be discussed and illustrated. Other sources of income must be determined legally permissible and to reasonably have the potential to be ongoing. The rent and income derived from the comparable data and applied to the subject property is considered on an annual basis. The income used in determining a gross income multiplier could be the potential gross income, PGI, or the effective gross income, EGI, and must be derived and applied consistently. The gross income multiplier is derived from properties with similar rent and other income flows. The particular feature or additional use of the property for which other income is being considered must be legally permissible by private and public regulations. In addition, the appraiser must determine that the source of the income could be reasonably determined to be applicable and desirable to those who compromise the market for such property. Let's look at some examples. For example, a single-family rental property has a garage located at the rear of the property. The garage is rented to an automotive mechanic. However, the subdivision restrictions as well as zoning prohibit such use of the garage. In this case, the use does not conform and the income should not be considered. This example illustrates that the garage's use might be detracting from the rental dwelling, or not what the typical landlord's action might be. A better way to analyze the subject property might be to consider the garage as a feature of the rental dwelling. Following is a similar scenario where the garage would most likely be expected or contribute more as a common amenity of the rental dwelling from a market standpoint. Page 179. For example, consider that a rental dwelling has been rented to the current lessee for an extended period of time. The lessee is somewhat unique in that he does not drive or own an automobile. Therefore, the garage is rented separately to the next door neighbor for storage of her boat, while the rent of the dwelling is discounted due to the lessee not needing the garage. In this example, the appraiser would need to consider if the typical tenant for such a property would expect a garage as a feature or have a use for it. In other words, is the ongoing use, as it is currently typical for landlords and tenants. Very likely, a typical tenant would own an automobile, and thus the typical landlord would rent the garage with the dwelling for use by the dwelling's occupant. In this case, the income from the rent of the garage to a third party should not be considered as other income, but rather analyzed with the rental dwelling, basing the market rent on similar houses with garages and using a GRM instead. Ideally, deriving the multiplier from properties that have garages included in the rent. A good way to consider whether the feature or potential use generating the income should be considered in the analysis, therefore indicating the applicability of the GIM technique is for the appraiser to think like a typical investor for such a property and to apply the principle of anticipation. Is this potential income source one that would be recognized and desired by most typical investors? One that does not detract from the rental units and would be considered an ongoing benefit to the investment? The GIM technique could be applied to most non-residential properties and may be relevant and ideal for some properties that are primarily residential in nature. In most residential cases, the GIM technique will be used more frequently for properties having 2 to 4 units or mixed use properties, such as a non-residential use of a lower floor unit with the residential use of the upper floor. However, there may be circumstances in which the GIM could be applied to a single-family investment property. The GIM, as mentioned earlier, could be developed using either potential gross income or effective gross income. The primary detriment of how the appraiser considers the multiplier depends on how the additional income flow is coming in. Very simply, is the source of the additional income based upon the occupancy level of the living units. This assists the appraiser in choosing to apply the GIM, defining the factor as either a potential gross income multiplier, PGIM, or an effective gross income multiplier, EGIM.